Otherwise, you guys are stuck in your seats, and you notice the worship team sitting down. I'm doing something today. I'm shaking up our normal flow of service here. I'm going to talk to you guys for a little bit because we're opening a series today, and we're opening a series on a Bible book. And so what I wanted to do was introduce you guys to the Bible book that we're going to open up. Can we go on to the first slide of that, please? Thank you. We're going to open up with just a little bit of introduction to the book of James. And guys, get excited, okay? Are you ready? We're going to have a history lesson. I know. We have some college students sitting going, I can do that tomorrow. But we have a little background that I want to cover, and I didn't want to do this during the normal message time. So we're going to give you a little bit of introduction, and then we're going to have a message, and then a real short sermon today afterwards, okay? So we're kind of breaking the message in half. One part to teach, one part to preach, and I'm going to keep the other half a little shorter than what I have been lately. So we're going to get you out of here at a decent time still. Book of James, let's hear about it a little bit. First question we're going to try to tackle is, who wrote the book of James? And before I do it, let me ask, how many people want to shout out an answer? Does anyone know how many people named James are in the New Testament? Pardon? 0. The word James appears nowhere in the Bible. But in the early 1600s, King James commissioned a translation of the Bible. And so he asks all his scholars that he bring together, and they're studying Greek and they're studying Hebrew. They even use the Latin Vulgate to give them some ideas at times. And they're doing all this studying, and James comes up. He says, so, is my name anywhere in there? They found it. New Testament people named Jacob, they changed to James. But if you read it in Greek, it'll say Jacob. If you read it in German, it'll say Jacob. It's Jacob. There is no James in the New Testament. Now, how many people do we in English, because of the King James Version, how many people do we call James in the New Testament? There's 4. A couple of which are bigger names, a couple of which are smaller names. So which of these 4 is believed to have written the book of James? Most likely it was Jesus' brother, or half-brother, Mary's son, Joseph's son, and he was called James the Just. Could you imagine growing up with Jesus as an older brother? How many of you had an older sibling that you were growing up, always in their shadow? I mean, I just picture going to the Torah school that they would go to as children, and I just picture the teacher going, can't you be more like your brother Jesus? Yeah, Mary's overheard talking to some of her friends going, yeah, my first kid was definitely the easiest. James sitting there stewing a little bit. It wouldn't be easy to grow up with Jesus as an older brother. So you know what? Jesus actually had 4 younger brothers. And none of them believed in him when he was on earth. There's a couple times in the Bible where they're like, Jesus, sit down, you're embarrassing us. And he goes on to teach. None of them followed him. After the resurrection, at least 2 of them did, because they actually have books in the New Testament. The book of Jude and the book of James are written by half-brothers of Jesus. But they didn't believe him until after the resurrection. Just kind of an interesting thing. He's called James the Just because he was known for living a very humble life, giving away as much as he could, and he was known for his prayer and his mercy. He was just a tremendous guy, and he was a huge leader in the early church. When the whole debate's going on, how much of the law do the Gentiles who are coming to Jesus have to follow? James was one of the first to say, and he's the one that wrote the opinion that said, you know what? Abstain from sexual immorality and a couple other little things, and you're good. You don't have to follow the law. You know, James, who we're going to talk about in this book as a big promoter of your actions, was not a big promoter of the law, despite what people think. When and why was James written? Well, there's a little more controversy on this one, not a huge amount, Almost everybody that I read, actually everybody that I read, believes that James the Just wrote the book of James. There's a little more, people having different thoughts on this, but most people would agree. So Paul, before he wrote any of his epistles, before he converted to Christianity, before he loved Jesus, he was a Pharisee, and he was persecuting the church. And in the mid-30s AD, he started persecuting the church, and a lot of the Christians who were converting, they left, they fled the area. And then in AD 44, there was another wave of persecution in the Jerusalem area where James was located, and this was actually done by Herod. And several were killed and things, so a lot of people fled the area. And a lot of people, including myself, think James wrote during the year or two after that persecution. So that happened in 44, so probably late 44, 45, somewhere in there is when James likely wrote this. And he was writing to people who were fleeing from persecution. And if you know, the persecution, one of the things that would happen, and this will become important not next week, but the week after, so I'm laying out some of this now, is land was very important in Jewish culture, and land was a family birthright. And when these people led, a lot of times the rich came in and took their land and abused them that way. And so that will come into play in a couple weeks. So if this is true, though, and James was writing to these people who were fleeing this persecution, then it was one of the first books written in the entire New Testament. Not the first, but among the first. Earlier than any of Paul's writings or any of that. So let's go to our next slide here. A few more things, because I haven't bored you enough with history yet. Chapter 1 of the book of James, I debated, do I do the entire series from chapter 1, or do I just skip through it all and ignore chapter 1? I'm going to try to find a middle ground. But chapter 1 lays out most of the themes that are developed in the rest of the book. Almost everything that James talks about in chapter 2 through 5 is referred to in chapter 1. So we're going to skip a lot of chapter 1 in this series. And next week we'll start into chapter 2. I'm going to cover a little of chapter 1 today. But chapter 1 is laying out groundwork. Here's the other thing you have to understand about the book of James. Next to Revelation and Daniel, it's probably the most misunderstood book in the entire Bible. People do not get James. As a matter of fact, Martin Luther, the Lutheran, traces back to Martin Luther. He translated the Bible into the common tongue in his land of Germany for people to read. And I actually have a Luther translation. And he did a good job. He initially did not translate the book of James. He called it a straw epistle. He said, this doesn't belong in here, because Luther was all about saved by faith alone. And James talks about works, and so a lot of people don't understand the book of James. Paul talks about faith. Sola fide is kind of the term that often flies around, faith alone. And because of that, some people think there's a battle between the teachings of Paul and James. I've never understood that. It is one of the most common things that people who are studying the New Testament talk about this. I've never understood it. To me, it's just very clear that there is no conflict between the two. But some people think it's a battle between faith in God and our works. And both Paul and James ultimately are teaching the same thing. If you have faith in God, it's going to change your heart. If you have faith in God, it's going to eventually move from here, and James talks very bluntly, especially in chapter 1, how faith here alone doesn't save you. But faith that moves to change your actions, that's a deep faith, that's a real faith, that's a saving faith. And if that faith is here, it's going to flow. Can you imagine a person who absolutely loves golf and they're passionate about golf and they're healthy and they're young and they watch it all, they study, but they won't play around of it? You kind of think, you love the game, you study the game, but you won't play the game? No, I don't like to play it, I just like to learn about it. You'd look at that person and think, you're a little off, wouldn't you? That's kind of the same thought here. James is looking out and saying, hey, if you're believing in this Jesus, if you're passionate about him, if you're studying him, something's going to happen and it's going to show. That if you have faith, it's not opposed to works, it leads to works. And because that is James's emphasis, it is the most practical book in my eyes, this is me speaking, of the New Testament. It is all about taking a look at ourselves, taking a look at our lives, and saying, are my actions backing up my faith, and is my faith supporting my actions? Are these two working together? That is the book of James, and that's why we're going to launch a series on it today. I'm going to ask the worship team to come back up. We're going to have one song to prepare our hearts to hear this call, and then when I come back, instead of teaching, I'll be preaching, so hang on.